the HOA The Line, the truth fights back.
My name is Ethan Carter, and before that morning, I thought the biggest problem in my neighborhood was the HOA complaining about trash cans. I was 33 years old and had lived in my house for almost 2 years. It was quiet, comfortable, and private. At least it was supposed to be. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. I was working from home when my internet suddenly disappeared. At first, I assumed it was a normal outage. I restarted the router. Nothing. I checked the modem. Still nothing. Then I looked outside. It's when I saw her. Karen Mitchell was standing near the side of my property with a pair of heavy-duty garden cutters in her hands. She was the HOA board member who had complained about almost everything I had done since moving in. My trash cans, my driveway, and my security camera. Even the small sign near my gate. But this time she wasn't holding a clipboard. She was standing beside the underground fiber line that connected my house to the street. And there was something very wrong. The protective cable casing had been cut open. I ran outside. "Karen, what did you do?" She didn't even look nervous. She simply told me that the HOA had decided the cable was unauthorized and had ordered it removed. I told her that wasn't an HOA decision. She smiled and said I could argue with the board later. Then she walked away. I looked down at the damaged line. Something about it bothered me. It wasn't just the fact that she had destroyed my internet. There was a small black equipment box beside the line that I had never noticed before. And it had no homeowner label. No internet company logo. Nothing. Just a tiny warning symbol and a serial number. I took a picture. Then I called my internet provider. The technician on the phone went completely silent when I gave him the serial number. Finally, he asked me one question. "Mr. Carter, where exactly did you say this equipment was?" I told him. He paused again. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Don't touch anything else." That's when I realized Karen hadn't just cut my internet. She had cut something she didn't understand. And whatever that cable was connected to, someone was already coming to find out why it had gone offline. The vehicles were still several minutes away when my phone rang again. It was the technician from my internet provider. His voice was completely different this time. He wasn't confused anymore. He sounded nervous. He asked me if the black equipment box was still connected to the damaged line. I told him I hadn't touched it. He said that was good. Then he told me something I never expected to hear from an internet technician. The equipment wasn't part of my normal residential service. He couldn't even access the information associated with it. I asked him who could. There was a long silence. Then he told me that a specialized security team had been notified because the line had suddenly gone offline. I thought he was exaggerating. Then I heard another vehicle outside. I looked through the window. 2 dark SUVs had stopped near the entrance to my street. Nobody got out immediately. They just sat there, watching. I walked outside. Karen was standing across the street. She looked toward the vehicles. For the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely frightened. One of the SUVs finally moved. It slowly drove toward my house and stopped near the damaged line. A man in a dark jacket stepped out. He didn't introduce himself. He simply asked me if I was Ethan Carter. I said yes. He looked at the cable. Then he looked at the equipment box. Then he asked me the question that made everything suddenly make sense. "Who cut this?" I pointed toward Karen's house. She immediately started protesting. She said she had only removed an unauthorized internet cable. The man looked at her. Then he looked back at me. He asked if I had touched anything since the line was damaged. I said no. He nodded. Then he told me that was probably the best decision I could have made. I asked him what the line actually was. He didn't answer. Instead, he told me that the cable was part of a secure communications network running through the area. My heart started pounding. I asked whether it belonged to the government. He simply said that he couldn't discuss the network. Then another vehicle arrived. This time, the person who stepped out was carrying a sealed equipment case. And that's when I realized Karen hadn't just caused an internet outage. She had triggered something much bigger. But the worst part was still coming. Because the man in the dark jacket asked me to show him every document the HOA had given me about that cable. And when he saw the HOA paperwork, his expression completely changed. The security specialist kept staring at the HOA paperwork. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he asked me where I had gotten the documents. I told him that HOA had sent them to me after Karen reported the cable as an unauthorized installation. He looked at the other specialist. They exchanged a glance. That was when I knew this wasn't about my internet anymore. The man carefully picked up one of the pages and asked me if the HOA had ever given me an official map showing the location of the cable. I said no. He asked if anyone from the HOA had inspected the line before Karen cut it. Again, I said no. Then he asked me something even stranger. Did Karen know what this cable was? I told him she claimed it was an illegal internet line. The specialist slowly shook his head. He said that was impossible. The cable had been installed long before I bought the house. And, according to the records he had just seen, there was supposed to be a restricted access corridor running through part of the neighborhood. I had never heard of it. Neither had most of my neighbors. Then he pointed to a section of the HOA document. There was an old property map attached to it. A narrow line ran directly behind several homes, including mine. He asked me to look closely. I recognized the location immediately. The cable wasn't simply running through my yard. It continued underneath the neighborhood. And the HOA had apparently known about the corridor for years. I asked why they had called it unauthorized. The specialist didn't answer. Instead, he asked me to call the HOA president. I put the call on speaker. The president answered. The specialist introduced himself and asked why the HOA had ordered the cable removed. There was silence. Then, the president claimed they had no record of any restricted communications corridor. The specialist asked him to repeat that. He did. But his voice had changed. Then the specialist told him that the original documents were in our hands. Another silence followed. Finally, the president said something that made the entire room go cold. He said the old records were supposed to have been destroyed. I looked at the specialist. He looked back at me. And suddenly we understood. Karen hadn't accidentally cut a mysterious cable. Someone had tried to erase the existence of that cable long before she ever picked up those cutters. The next morning, Daniel came back before sunrise. He wasn't alone. 2 specialists arrived with him and carried equipment cases into my backyard. Nobody was talking about that way anymore. Nobody was talking about my internet. They were focused entirely on the cable. Daniel told me that the network was part of an old secure communication system installed before most of the neighborhood had even been built. I asked him why something like that would run through a residential community. He said the original development had been constructed around an existing communications corridor. The houses came later. The network came first. That explained why the cable had been buried beneath private property. But it didn't explain why the HOA had tried to erase it. Daniel showed me another document. It was an old infrastructure agreement. The document identified a protected corridor that could not be altered without authorization. And there was something strange about the signatures. One of the people who had approved the original development was connected to the company that later helped establish the HOA. I asked Daniel if that meant the HOA knew about the network. He said it meant someone connected to the HOA almost certainly knew. Then the specialists began testing the damaged line. One of the monitors suddenly lit up. A signal was still active, even though Karen had cut the physical connection. Daniel immediately told everyone to step back. The equipment started recording. Something was trying to reconnect. Then another signal appeared. It wasn't coming from my house. It was coming from underneath the neighborhood. Daniel looked at me and said the damaged line had triggered an automatic security response. Karen had accidentally created a digital breadcrumb, and whoever was monitoring the network now knew exactly where the interruption had occurred. I asked Daniel whether Karen was in serious trouble. He said that depended on what the investigation discovered. Then he asked me something unexpected. He wanted to know whether the HOA had ever tried to force me to remove my security cameras. I remembered. They had. Several times. I suddenly realized why. My cameras covered the exact side of the property where the cable ran underground. And one of them had recorded Karen cutting the line. Daniel looked at the footage. Then he smiled for the first time. He told me that video might be the most important evidence they had. But there was one problem. The HOA had already requested that I delete it. And now we knew exactly why. By that evening, the entire situation had changed. What started as a simple HOA complaint had become an investigation into a communications corridor that had been hidden beneath our neighborhood for decades. And the security footage gave us the one thing we needed. Proof. Daniel sent the recording to the investigators. Then he asked me to stay inside while they contacted the HOA. 20 minutes later, Karen arrived with the HOA president. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked nervous. The president immediately demanded that I hand over the documents and delete the security footage. I refused. Daniel stepped forward and told them the footage was now part of an official investigation. The president's face went pale. Karen tried to explain that she never knew what the cable was. She said she had only followed HOA instructions. Then Daniel asked her one question. Who told you to cut it? Karen froze. She looked at the HOA president. He looked away. That was the answer. The investigators had already found emails showing that the HOA had been trying to remove references to the communications corridor from neighborhood records. The reason was simple. The HOA wanted control over a section of land that wasn't actually theirs. They had been using outdated maps to convince homeowners that the corridor didn't exist. And my property was the one place where the original documentation had survived. Karen hadn't discovered the secret. She had accidentally exposed it. Then came the final shock. The communications network wasn't being used to monitor homeowners. It was an emergency backup system for critical government communications. Cutting the line had triggered a security response. But the investigation uncovered something even bigger. Someone connected to the HOA had been accessing restricted infrastructure records for years. The HOA president was removed from his position. The investigation continued. And Karen? She had to answer for destroying protected infrastructure and for lying about why she did it. As for me, I kept my house. I kept my property. And most importantly, I kept the original documents. A week later, the damaged line was professionally repaired. Before leaving, Daniel shook my hand and told me something I'll never forget. He said I had made the right decision by taking a picture instead of touching that equipment. Then he looked toward the HOA clubhouse. Sometimes, he said, the smallest piece of evidence is the one that brings down the biggest lie. Karen thought she was cutting my internet. She had no idea she was cutting open a secret that someone had spent years trying to bury. And this time, the truth was impossible to disconnect.